This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello, I'm Lynda Kinkade, live from CNN's World Headquarters here in Atlanta. Welcome to One World. Any use of chemical weapons by Moscow would totally change the nature of Russia's war on Ukraine. That warning from NATO's chief, who says the alliance will increase its forces in the region. Now, this comes ahead of tomorrow's emergency NATO summit. US President Joe Biden on his way to Brussels right now, where he'll join that meeting. Well, on the ground in Ukraine, Russian forces are striking homes, a shopping mall, and other buildings in Kyiv. Ukrainian forces, meanwhile, are pushing back, trying to regain control of some territory near the capital. This was a firefight between Ukrainian and Russian forces, roughly 45 kilometers from Kyiv. It appears Ukraine's counteroffensive is seeing some success. Ukrainian National Police say they're resuming work in Irpin, a northwest suburb of Kyiv. And the mayor there says he believes his city is now 80% under Ukrainian control. Well, we are getting a fresh look at damage from unrelenting Russian bombardment in Mariupol. Drone footage shows smoldering buildings, many of them residential, and widespread destruction across the port city. And there is word today that a convoy of 11 buses attempting to get into Mariupol to evacuate civilians were commandeered by Russian forces and driven off to an unknown location. Well, Ukraine's president addressing two more governments today, Japanese lawmakers earlier, and in the last few hours, the French. And this comes ahead of Volodymyr Zelensky's expected video appearance at that emergency NATO meeting tomorrow. Mr. Zelensky warned Japan's parliament about the dangers Ukraine faces from Russian attacks on nuclear plants. And while speaking to the French parliament, Zelensky asked them to observe a moment of silence for Ukrainians killed in the Russian invasion, while again appealing for help. Well, right now, the US president is on his way to Brussels ahead of crisis talks with fellow world leaders. On Thursday, Joe Biden will meet with NATO allies to discuss the ongoing response to Russia's brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine. Before departing Washington, the president warned that Moscow's use of chemical warfare is a, quote, real threat. A source says Mr. Biden will announce a new round of Russian sanctions once he arrives in Belgium. Well, CNN's Natasha Betrand joins us from NATO headquarters in Brussels. But first, I want to go to John Harwood, who joins us from Washington. Good to have you both with us. So, John, this is US President Biden's first overseas trip since this invasion began last month. And the US is set to impose more sanctions this week on hundreds of members of Russia's parliament.
Well, what the president and his NATO allies and European allies are trying to do is increase pressure on Vladimir Putin during a military campaign that is not going his way. Vladimir Putin is not achieving his objectives. He's killing a lot of people, but he's not achieving his strategic objectives. And so as he gets more brutal in the conduct of the Russian forces, the specific things that the president wants to do on this trip are, one, talk about how to bolster NATO's force posture, not in Ukraine, but adjacent to Ukraine. Secondly, increase the sanctions to increase pressure on Vladimir Putin. And then third, to try to maintain the unity that has been so striking during this conflict. Russia was counting on the West dividing and being weak. He's gotten the opposite, and President Biden's trying to keep the pressure on.
Yeah, absolutely. That pressure greatly needed. Well, I want to go to Natasha because we are expected to see the alliance agree to an increase in defense spending. But also you spoke to the NATO Secretary General and asked him about what it would mean if Russia deployed chemical weapons.
Yeah, Lynda, so this is a question that we've been asking repeatedly is what are those red lines and what will NATO be prepared to do if Russia does cross those red lines? Of course, the international community has made it very clear that if Russia were to deploy weapons of mass destruction, if they were to deploy a chemical weapons attack, which the U.S. has made very clear in recent days is a very big possibility, then it would be a complete violation of international law and it would be completely unacceptable. So the question that we've been asking is, would NATO's position here change at all if Russia did deploy those kinds of weapons. And when I asked the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg this question earlier today, he would not go into detail about what NATO would do in response to that, but he did say that the use of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of this war. Take a listen.
Any use of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of the conflict. And it will be a blatant violation of international law and will have far-reaching consequences. And I think that's the most important message to convey.
So what he also said, which was very interesting, is that allies tomorrow are expected to agree upon additional equipment being sent to Ukraine, additional weaponry and, of course, additional protective equipment that they intend to send to the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian people. And interestingly, that does include protective gear that can potentially shield them from chemical, biological, and even nuclear attacks. Lynda.
Thanks to you, Natasha. I just want to go back to John on whether there could be any more movement on Ukraine's demands. Those demands including a no-fly zone across Ukraine, more fighter jets. Anything else we can expect to hear from the president?
I would not expect movement on those, Lynda. The president has been very consistent in drawing a line beyond which he and NATO are not willing to cross because of the risk of escalating a conflict with Russia directly that, as the president has said, could bring about World War III. I think that, as Natasha was just indicating, more defensive weaponry for the Ukrainians, keep their military supplied because the Ukrainian military is doing a very effective job in holding off the Russians, but not crossing that line and engaging directly with the Russians.
All right, we will be following these meetings closely over the following 24, 48 hours. John Harwood for us in DC, Natasha Betrand in Brussels. Good to have you both with us.